let's go back to that concept of kind of adversity and strife uniting queer people. And Eric, one notable, I guess, exception to that is in regards to early trans activists like Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson, who were incredibly important and kind of at the center of Stonewall, who led that charge, and yet understandably didn't feel like they had a place in Kameni's movement and had to kind of, actually splinter off and start their own. And so, what parallels, I guess, do you see between the early gay rights battle and the early trans rights battle? How did they really manifest? And if you could just give us a little background on that.
Well, one tried and true part of history also and of activism is that very often victims of persecution then embrace some of the tactics and characteristics of their own oppressor. And I think you see that time and time again through history, and you see it in my book with, like you mentioned, activists like Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera. Before their own trans organization, they were members of the Gay Activists Alliance because they saw, the term gay was a much wider term, and they saw themselves as part of this larger struggle, which they were. But it was the cis white gay men within the Gay Activists Alliance who said, actually, you pose a threat because of your transgression of gender norms. You pose a threat to the image that we're trying to project of respectability, of we're just like you. And so they quite literally pushed them out of the movement, and they had to start in response their own organization, which was Street Transvestites originally for gay power, right? And then once the Gay Activists Alliance refused to support them, refused to participate in their demonstrations, said in executive committee meeting minutes that they were organized by street people, so the Gay Activists Alliance wouldn't be a part of it. Once they realized that they had been betrayed and that actually, yes, they were for gay power, but the gays were not for them, that's when they changed the name of their organization to Street Transvestites Action Revolutionaries, right? So that was not very similar to the activists who, Frank Hamney, if he had his way, he would have gone to space and would have been part of the formation of NASA. He didn't want to be an activist. He didn't want to make his gay identity a core part of his entire life and of his activism. It was thrust upon him. And you see that same phenomenon happening within the movement also for the most marginalized, who were essentially sacrificed, but as the book shows, it's self-defeating. It ended up just hurting the entire community because it was creating these fractures.
I think that's a really important point to make, which is that Frank Kameny did not want to be an activist, but was forced to be one, whereas Sylvia Rivera had no choice but to be an activist. Because as you show in your book, when the cops descend on Stonewall, the only people they've got something against on the Stonewall Inn, the only people they've got something against are the trans people, because they can get them for masquerading as women, which is against the law. And I was speaking earlier about this, what happens when queer people decide that they're no longer going to be on the down low. And I think what's really important to bear in mind when one's thinking about the human rights of LGBTQ people is that there's some people in that alphabet who cannot be on the down low because of the way they are. And those are the people on the front line. And there's a saying that all homophobia is transphobia. And I think that there's a lot of truth to that, because when society fears the homosexual, what society has in its mind, or when Joe McCarthy or Vladimir Putin is rallying the faithful against the homosexual, what's being rallied against is this image of the deviant, of the pervert, which is best represented by a man in a dress. And for this reason, I see increasingly, particularly as marriage equality has come into play, particularly in the West, and as more and more gay people have come out, and therefore everybody can say they know someone, they have someone in their family or close to them in a place like the United States or Ireland who is gay or lesbian, who they love, as homosexuality has been sort of normalized, the new frontier, the new pink line, has to do with gender identity and what the opponents of transgender people call gender ideology.
Well, Mark, let's continue along that line, because for me, one of the most striking observations of your book is how new identities may be coined by the West that are designed to provide a sort of liberation, right, to queer people across the world actually end up having negative consequences. So, you think of the folks in your book who populate the Indian fishing village, right, who are sex workers and who are third gender people and who do not identify necessarily as trans until that identity is introduced to them. So can you talk, I guess, a little bit about the complications of what happens when, those identities are maybe spread around?
I mean, it's fascinating and complex. And the context of it is that identities are globalized now because of the digital revolution, because of a global human rights struggle, because of mass migration, because of the way people move, travel, come back with ideas. The kind of atomized, isolated community doesn't exist anymore, barely exists, except in the imagination of right-wing nationalists like Viktor Orban, who thinks he can cauterize Hungary from the world. So you've got people who have always had space in their society as third gender or as somewhat fluid. They might be called bakla in the Philippines. They might be called hijras or koti in India. They might be called gojigen in Senegal. And all these terms mean in some way or another man, woman. And they've got their space in their society, and let's not glorify it the way the American queer movement sometimes glorifies Native American two-spirited people. They have their space, but it's quite a limited space.
Right, still marginalized.
It's a limited, and it's not necessarily marginalized. I mean, I wouldn't say that bakla in the Philippines are marginalized, because every hairdresser is bakla. And bakla are on the main road and in the market. They have their job, they have their space, they're valued. They're beauty therapists and they're beauty queens, but that is it. You cannot push through that glass ceiling. So along comes a global LGBT or trans movement and says, you know what? You don't have to stay in this muddy area where you can only be a hairdresser, where you're neither male nor female. Just flip over to a trans identity. Get the hormones, have the surgery if you can afford it, take on a trans, become a woman. And once you're a woman, you can be anything. In fact, as a female transgender woman, I am now, one of the activists says, a member of Congress, which is true in the Philippines. She is a woman who is transgender, who is now a member of Congress. She is not a hairdresser. And this is extraordinarily appealing and opens horizons, obviously. But what it does in the process is it transforms what was previously a gender spectrum into something more of a gender binary. And for those people who are along the spectrum, through some combination of choice or just physicality, it's very, very difficult. And similarly, for those people, like I'll tell you very quickly about the Gojigen in Senegal, because it's a fascinating story. People in Dakar who for decades have male body but present as women, and who live in Wolof society as women and have certain responsibilities that are really valued. Along comes AIDS in the early 21st century. And in the wake of AIDS comes a gay rights movement around reaching men who have sex with men. And homosexuality suddenly becomes a topic in Senegalese society. Never spoken about before. It suddenly becomes a topic. There is the kind of moral panic we were talking about. Homosexuals become folk devils. They get arrested. They get thrown in jail. Homosexuality is evil and it's wrong. And overnight, like that, the Gorjigen disappear. Because they are the most visible face of this new perversion that society didn't talk about previously. So overnight, what was a gender identity that's acceptable, even valued, becomes a sexual orientation that is evil and anti-Islamic. And space closes down in Wolof society, in Senegalese society as a consequence.
So Eric, let's talk about, you know, that those consequences of assimilation and, you know, what happens as a result of introducing identity. And you know, you write quite a bit about respectability in your book, which is still an incredibly charged word in regards to queer identity and pride. And, you know, you write about how Kameni performed what you call respectable homosexuality, and gay was good, but only a certain type of gay was good. Men in suit and ties, women in dresses, mostly cis people, mostly white people. I love this quote you have from a reporter covering an early protest who describes the protesters: "No bottled in blonde men, limp wrists, or lisping here, thank you." So why was respectability so important to Kameni, Eric? And do you think he would have accomplished what he did without this notion? And who did it leave out?
Well, it's a good question because, you know, you have to remember, even though they were wearing suits and ties and the women were wearing dresses, it was still a horrifying thing to do. And so I think it's important to remember on a psychological level that if they were thinking of it more as a performance, not just of activism and a performance of citizenship, but also a performance of gender, which, you know, you see time and time again in activism, where you make your message as palatable as possible to the general public, to the oppressor, then, at least in theory, then it's much easier for the oppressor or the state to actually embrace what you're saying. My personal opinion is that it's much more of a psychological tactic of the activists, because I think it makes it easier for them to be making the same claims and for them to be the ones holding the picket signs that make these very, very radical claims about homosexuals being just as equal as anyone else. So I think it made it easier for them. But as you said, on the flip side, it's very exclusionary because, Mark talks about the gender binary and how that's being constructed every day and maintained. Well, activists were responsible for playing into that same exact binary and utilizing it as a tool. And what that does is, if you have a dress code saying that, men have to be wearing suits and women have to be wearing dresses, then that is excluding not just people who are trans or who fall somewhere on the spectrum of the gender binary. It also excludes a lot of other people, like, that we're talking about the 1960s, that excludes hippies, right? Hippies had beards and long hair. They were explicitly prohibited from participating in these marches. So that's why, I write about activism before Stonewall, and we have to talk about it and be appreciative of the bravery there. But we also have to understand why their movement was so limited and why Stonewall was so important, because it didn't create something new. It changed something that already existed and expanded it on a massive scale.